Maria Delgado lived a life that looked ordinary from the outside. She drove the same car to work every day, a silver sedan that never drew much attention. She liked quiet places, small coffee shops, neighborhood grocery stores, and parks where she could sit for a while without anyone noticing her. People who saw her often thought she was just another woman getting through her daily routine. Some neighbors guessed she worked in an office downtown, maybe as an accountant or a teacher. No one really knew much about her, and that was exactly how she wanted it. What they didn't know was that Maria worked as a federal investigator. She had spent years learning how to blend into the background, to watch without being watched, and to gather details that most people would overlook. For Maria, silence was not empty, it was filled with information. Every casual word someone said, every repeated pattern of behavior, every slip of nervousness could be a clue. Her job was not like the one seen in movies where everything exploded in dramatic fashion. Her world was quieter, slower, and much more careful. She worked undercover on cases that took months, sometimes years, to build. Most of her days were filled with patient observation, endless notes, and waiting for the right moment to act. It required discipline, but Maria had always been patient. She believed that truth revealed itself to those willing to wait long enough to see it. At this time in her career, Maria was assigned to a case that was both sensitive and dangerous in its own way. There had been growing whispers in several small towns about officers misusing their power. Citizens complained that they were being stopped without reason, searched without explanation, and sometimes pressured into signing documents they didn't understand. For years, these complaints had been dismissed as misunderstandings. But Maria's agency knew better. Where there were repeated complaints, there was usually a deeper pattern. Maria's task was simple to explain but hard to carry out. She was to move quietly through these towns, gather evidence, and piece together the truth. She couldn't arrive with a badge and loud questions, because that would only cause people to close their doors. Instead, she lived like an ordinary woman, shopping where locals shopped, eating at diners, and striking up casual conversations with waiters, cashiers, and barbers. Slowly, bit by bit, she learned the rhythms of the town. People trusted her because she never pushed too hard. She had a gentle way of listening, which made others share more than they realized. Someone at the grocery store might mention an officer's unusual late-night visit to their neighbor's home. A mechanic might complain about being pulled over 3 times in a single month without reason. A waitress at a diner might casually mention that one officer always came in with new gadgets or money that didn't seem to match his paycheck. Individually, these were just small remarks. But to Maria, they were pieces of a larger puzzle. Maria also had another way of working, watching body language. She believed people's actions often spoke louder than their words. If an officer walked with too much arrogance, if he looked around nervously when certain names were mentioned, if he avoided eye contact at the wrong moment, Maria took note. Her notebook was full of tiny observations that seemed ordinary but would later prove important. Her life during these months looked dull to anyone who didn't know her real purpose. She would wake up early, drive across town, stop at a coffee shop, write in her notebook, then visit 1 or 2 places where she might overhear conversations. Sometimes she sat at a park bench for hours, pretending to read while actually paying attention to who met whom and at what time. To her neighbors, she looked like a woman who had too much free time. To her agency, she was the center of an investigation that had the potential to uncover misconduct. Maria's calm presence and patience were what made her effective. But even the most patient investigator needs to keep their guard up, because there is always risk. The kind of people she was quietly observing were not fools. They had their own instincts, and some of them were skilled at reading people. If anyone grew suspicious that Maria was not who she appeared to be, the entire operation could be in danger. She knew this, and that knowledge gave her every reason to keep her cover perfect. At times, she felt the loneliness of the work. She couldn't tell her neighbors who she really was. She couldn't explain to the friendly waitress why she always asked for the corner booth where she could see the door. She couldn't share with the cashier why she paid attention to every police car that parked outside the store. Her world was full of secrets, and those secrets weighed heavily. But Maria reminded herself why she was doing it, because the truth mattered, and because people deserved protection from those who misused authority. Despite the pressure, Maria often found strength in small, simple routines. She carried a journal where she wrote not just professional notes but also her private reflections. She reminded herself of her father's words when she was younger: "Patience will protect you when courage is not enough." She drank tea every evening, a ritual that gave her a moment of calm no matter how tense the day had been. And she prayed quietly in her own way, asking for guidance, wisdom, and clarity. These small acts helped her stay grounded. Then, there was the silver sedan. It wasn't just her car, it was part of her cover. Ordinary enough to be ignored, but reliable enough to take her anywhere she needed to go. She kept it spotless, never allowing clutter, because she knew her car might be noticed or inspected from the outside. To others, it was just a basic vehicle. To Maria, it was her safe space, her mobile office, and sometimes her only company after long days of silence. What Maria didn't know yet was that her quiet life and her careful work were about to be tested. The case she was building had reached a stage where some of the suspects were becoming uneasy. They had noticed small things too: someone listening, someone always present but never talking too much. And when people like that grow uneasy, they act. For now, Maria carried on, unaware that her car, the same sedan she trusted as part of her safety, would soon become the very stage of a dangerous encounter. But in this moment, in the calm before the storm, she remained focused only on her duty, to gather truth, to remain unseen, and to wait for the right time to reveal what she had learned. Maria had grown used to her routine. Most days followed the same rhythm: observe, listen, take notes, and quietly move on before anyone noticed her staying too long in one place. She believed in consistency, because it made her appear ordinary. The townspeople had begun to accept her presence. Some even greeted her warmly now, as though she had always lived among them. That was exactly how Maria wanted it. But with every week that passed, she could sense the investigation moving into more dangerous territory. The officers she was watching were not careless men. They were alert, sharp, and, in many ways, just as observant as she was. Maria knew that the closer she came to the truth, the more likely they would notice her. It was like walking across thin ice. At first, it seemed solid, but with every step forward, the risk of falling through grew higher. One evening, as she was leaving a diner, Maria noticed something that unsettled her. A patrol car was parked 2 blocks down, its lights off but its engine faintly running. She could just barely see the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat, watching the street. When she walked toward her sedan, the car didn't move, but she could feel the weight of eyes following her. Maria's instincts told her to act normal. She unlocked her car, slid into the driver's seat, and drove away as though nothing unusual had happened. Still, the moment stuck in her mind. She had spent too long in this line of work to dismiss such signs. It meant someone was beginning to notice her patterns. Maria's notes at this stage of the case were detailed. She had logged conversations that hinted at extra money circulating among certain officers. She had observed visits to places that didn't make sense for regular patrol routes. She had even caught small exchanges of envelopes, quick and quiet, between uniformed men and strangers in unmarked cars. These were all signals, and they were slowly building into a picture her agency could use. But she also understood the other side of the story: if she could see them, they could eventually see her. And that was the danger she now faced. Her routine began to shift slightly. Maria noticed unfamiliar cars parked across from her apartment building, vehicles that didn't belong to any of her neighbors. Once, she returned home and found her doormat turned sideways, though she was sure she had left it straight. These might have been coincidences, but Maria had learned not to believe too much in coincidences. She grew more cautious, double-checking her locks, changing her routes, and timing her errands differently each day. One night, after visiting the grocery store, Maria returned to her car and noticed the faintest scratch along the driver's side door. It hadn't been there before. She bent down to look closer, running her finger across the mark. It was almost like a signal, something done deliberately, perhaps to remind her that others could touch her world just as easily as she observed theirs. Maria didn't panic. She never allowed herself to. Instead, she took a deep breath and reminded herself of the bigger picture. If they were growing suspicious of her, it meant she was close to something important. In her line of work, pressure often confirmed progress. Still, there was another side to this growing tension. Maria's cover identity was carefully built. She was supposed to be just a woman who moved into town for quiet work and a slower lifestyle. To protect that identity, she had to remain consistent with her story. But with every strange incident, she felt the weight of the truth pressing on her. How long could she pretend before someone demanded answers she couldn't give? Her silver sedan, once her safe space, now became something she watched closely. She checked the back seat every time before getting in. She glanced at her mirrors more than usual, making sure no car followed her too closely. She even started parking in different spots to avoid predictability. Yet despite all her caution, she could not shake the feeling that something was coming, that the ice beneath her feet was about to crack. It was during this period of unease that Maria first crossed paths more directly with Officer Raymond Holt. She had seen him before, of course, tall, confident, always walking with a kind of pride that drew attention. Holt was respected by many in town. He had a reputation for being tough but reliable, the kind of officer who never hesitated to take charge. To most people, he looked like a protector. But to Maria, his name had already appeared too many times in whispered conversations and suspicious reports. Their first real encounter came in the simplest way. Maria was at the gas station, filling her car, when Holt pulled up at the next pump. He gave her a friendly smile and nodded. "Haven't seen you around before," he said casually. Maria returned the smile, keeping her tone light. "Just moved here a few months ago. Still getting used to the town." Holt chuckled. "It's a quiet place, most of the time. You'll like it here." On the surface, it was a normal exchange. But Maria felt his eyes linger on her a second too long, as though measuring her words. She kept her expression calm, thanked him, and left without giving anything away. Yet in her notebook that night, she wrote, "Hold aware. Watch for more." After that day, Maria began noticing Holt more often. He appeared at the diner where she liked to have coffee. He drove by the street where she lived, though his patrol area didn't include it. Once, she spotted him parked outside a small park where she usually went to read. He never confronted her directly, but his presence became too frequent to ignore. Maria understood what this meant. Holt was testing her, the same way she had been observing him. He was trying to see if she would slip, if her story would show cracks. It was a quiet game, played without words but with real consequences. The tension grew heavier. Maria's agency checked in with her regularly, but she kept most of her concerns to herself. She knew that showing too much worry could cause the operation to shift prematurely. Timing was everything. Still, she prepared for the possibility that her cover might be blown. And then, one evening, the test came. Maria left a small bookstore and walked toward her sedan. As she reached for the handle, something caught her eye inside the car. Tucked neatly behind the passenger seat was a small black bag she had never seen before. Her heartbeat quickened, though her face remained calm. She opened the door, slid in, and closed it softly behind her. Slowly, she pulled the bag into her lap and unzipped it. Inside were rolled up bills, a few small packets, and a half-finished police form with a name scribbled across it. It was meant to look like evidence, planted evidence. Maria sat in silence, her hands steady on the bag. She knew immediately what this was, a trap. Someone wanted her caught with it, someone wanted her reputation destroyed before she could ever act. And judging by the style of the setup, Maria already had a strong idea whose hand was behind it. That night, as she drove away, her mind was clear. The challenge was no longer about gathering whispers and subtle observations. The game had changed. The suspect she had been quietly watching was no longer just watching her back, he was now trying to push her off the board entirely. Maria drove home that night with the small black bag resting on the passenger seat beside her. She didn't open it again. She didn't need to. The sight of the contents earlier had already told her everything she needed to know. The money, the packets, the incomplete form, they had not been left by accident. Someone had chosen her car carefully. Someone wanted her to be found with it. The streets looked normal as she drove, but Maria felt the air around her had changed. Every headlight in her rearview mirror, every pedestrian who glanced her way, felt heavier now. She parked her sedan in its usual spot but stayed inside for a while, her fingers resting gently on the steering wheel. To anyone watching, she looked like a tired woman pausing before gathering her groceries. But inside, her mind was clear and steady. Maria was not shocked by what had happened. She had been in this field long enough to know that pressure always rose when the truth was near. What unsettled her was the boldness. Someone wasn't simply suspicious of her anymore, they were confident enough to try to frame her. That meant they felt threatened. And a threatened person often became reckless. Instead of taking the bag upstairs to her apartment, Maria drove to her agency's field office, an unremarkable brick building a few towns away. She carried the bag inside, her steps calm and deliberate. The night shift team, already familiar with her quiet ways, immediately understood that this was important. Inside a private office, Maria placed the bag on the table. The others gathered around, their faces serious. She explained how she had found it, her words steady, each detail laid out like pieces of a puzzle. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Finally, her supervisor nodded. "We knew it was close. This confirms it." The investigation had already been building for months. Surveillance tapes, phone records, financial documents, and even a few hesitant witness statements all pointed in the same direction. But now they had something more powerful, proof that someone had taken a direct step to silence her. That single act tied desperation to guilt. For weeks, the team had been holding back one final move, a federal warrant. They had been cautious, not wanting to act too soon. But with this new piece of evidence, the picture was complete. The warrant could now be signed with full confidence. Maria sat quietly as the decision was made. She felt no sense of triumph, only a calm clarity. She knew the road ahead was still dangerous. People who acted boldly once could act even more boldly again. But now, she also knew that time was no longer on the other side. The case was turning. The next morning, Maria returned to her quiet routine, as though nothing unusual had happened. She went to the coffee shop, ordered her usual drink, and sat near the window with a notebook. From the outside, she looked exactly as she always had. But inside, she carried the knowledge that everything had shifted. The bag in her car had not weakened her, it had given her the final key. That afternoon, her path crossed once again with Officer Raymond Holt. He entered the same diner where she was having lunch. His uniform was crisp, his movements confident, his smile as practiced as ever. He noticed her at once and gave a small nod, almost friendly. Maria returned the gesture with a polite smile, her eyes calm, her manner relaxed. She knew now what he had done, and soon, he would know what she had been. But this was not the moment. Timing, she reminded herself, was everything. Over the next few days, Maria prepared silently. The warrant was finalized, signed, and placed into her hands. She carried it in a slim folder, tucked neatly into her bag. On its pages was Holt's name, written in official ink, backed by months of careful work. It was an unusual feeling to carry such a document. To everyone around her, she was still the quiet woman living in a rented apartment. But in her possession was a piece of paper that could change everything for the man who thought he controlled the game. Maria studied Holt closely during these days. She noticed how he carried himself at the precinct, how he spoke to colleagues, how he acted with townspeople. Outwardly, he seemed untouchable, laughing, joking, moving with authority. Yet she also noticed small cracks. His eyes scanned more carefully than before. He lingered longer when he saw her. He even asked her, one afternoon in passing, where she worked. Maria kept her voice even and her story consistent. Just doing some freelance consulting, she said lightly, as though it were the most boring thing in the world. Holt smiled, but Maria saw a flicker in his expression. He wasn't satisfied. The final turning point came sooner than expected. One morning, Maria received word from her agency, the operation was moving to its close. The warrant would be served. The timing had been chosen carefully when Holt least expected it, and when his guard was lowest. Maria's role was central. She had been the one he had tried to frame. She had been the quiet shadow he never quite figured out. Now, she would be the one to step forward with the truth. That evening, Maria prepared herself with the same quiet rituals she always used. She wrote briefly in her journal, noting the date, the weather, and a single line, "Tomorrow, the silence ends." She set out her simple clothes for the next day, nothing flashy, just enough to blend in as always. And she placed the folder with the warrant on her desk, where it rested like a calm weight waiting to be lifted. When dawn broke, Maria drove her silver sedan through the quiet streets. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the road. To her, the town looked unchanged: shops opening, children walking to school, people greeting each other. But she knew that by the end of the day, one of its most respected figures would be standing in handcuffs, his authority stripped away. Maria parked outside the precinct, her hands steady on the steering wheel for a brief moment. She glanced at the folder beside her. Then she stepped out, walking toward the building with calm steps. She wasn't nervous, and she wasn't eager. She was simply ready. Inside, Holt was moving through the hallway, chatting casually with another officer. His laughter carried down the corridor, easy and confident. When he turned and saw Maria standing there, he gave the same practiced smile he always used. But this time, Maria did not return it. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out the folder. Slowly, firmly, she opened it to reveal the warrant, her eyes meeting his with quiet certainty. Holt's smile froze. For the first time, the confidence in his face flickered into something else, something he could not control. The hallway of the precinct was filled with its usual noise: phones ringing in offices, the low murmur of conversations, and the occasional sound of footsteps echoing against the polished floor. It was an ordinary morning for everyone inside. But for Maria, the moment felt suspended in time. She stood with the folder in her hand, the federal warrant visible, her gaze steady on Officer Raymond Holt. For weeks, she had watched him, studied his behavior, and quietly gathered pieces of a puzzle that only she and her team truly understood. And now, that puzzle was complete. Holt's smile, so often used to charm or disarm, faltered as his eyes fell on the official document. He blinked once, as though hoping he had misread what he saw. But the bold print of his name left no room for doubt. The other officers in the hallway turned their attention toward the scene. Some looked confused. Others frowned, as though trying to make sense of what was happening. Holt, who had always seemed untouchable, was suddenly the focus of something far larger than the building he worked in. Maria spoke clearly, her voice calm and professional. "Officer Raymond Holt, this warrant is for you." Her words carried more weight than volume. Every syllable seemed to echo in the corridor. Holt's posture stiffened, and his usual air of confidence seemed to slip, piece by piece. Two federal marshals stepped forward, their presence firm but controlled. They had been waiting nearby, ready for this exact moment. The sight of them erased any doubt from the faces of the other officers watching. This was not a misunderstanding. This was official. Holt glanced around the hallway, perhaps hoping to find support in the familiar faces of his colleagues. But silence met him instead. The same men and women who had once laughed at his jokes and followed his lead now stood frozen, uncertain. Maria could see it in their eyes, shock, disbelief, and a growing realization that the rumors they had ignored for so long might have been true. "Is this a joke?" Holt finally said, his voice carrying a forced laugh that didn't match his expression. Maria shook her head gently. "It's not a joke. The investigation has been ongoing for months. You are required to come with us." The calmness of her words made them more powerful than any loud declaration. Holt's shoulders tensed, but he didn't argue further. He must have understood that resisting would only make things worse. The marshal stepped closer, guiding him with professional care. His badge and weapon were quietly removed, placed into evidence bags with practiced efficiency. For the first time, Holt walked the hallway not as an officer but as someone under investigation. His colleagues stepped aside, watching in silence as he was escorted past them. Maria followed at a short distance, her steps steady. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction in his fall. Her work had never been about personal victories. It was about truth, about restoring balance where power had been misused. As they moved outside, the morning air felt sharper, brighter. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, casting light across the precinct parking lot. A few townspeople stood nearby, having gathered out of curiosity. Their whispers began the moment they saw Holt flanked by federal agents. To them, the image was almost unbelievable, the officer they had trusted, now being led away. Maria kept her focus forward. She didn't let herself dwell on the whispers or the expressions of shock. What mattered was the process. Holt was placed in a federal vehicle, the door closing with a soft finality. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Conversations buzzed in low voices. Officers who had once defended Holt's reputation exchanged uneasy glances. Questions lingered in their eyes: how long had this been going on? How much did they truly know about the man who had worked beside them for years? Maria returned to the office where the paperwork was being processed. She sat down quietly, folding her hands on the desk, letting the others handle the formalities. She had carried the investigation this far, but now it was in the hands of the legal system. Still, her mind lingered on the details. She remembered every small sign she had observed: the extra money, the strange routes, the carefully planted bag in her own car. Each piece had seemed so small at first, almost invisible. But together, they had formed a picture strong enough to withstand scrutiny. Later that afternoon, Maria stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. The town felt different now, as though an invisible weight had been lifted. Yet she knew the work wasn't truly over. Holt's arrest was only the beginning. His name would lead to others, and his actions would open doors to questions still unanswered. She leaned against her silver sedan, the same car that had once been turned into a trap. It seemed almost symbolic now: what had been used against her had become the very reason the truth had surfaced. She thought about that carefully, about how quickly appearances could shift. As the hours passed, more information began to unfold. Files were gathered, financial records were reviewed again, and the connections that Holt had tried so hard to hide were now laid bare. Every hidden path, every suspicious exchange, was becoming clearer under the light of scrutiny. In the days that followed, Maria noticed the change in the townspeople. Some were relieved, feeling that their quiet complaints had finally been heard. Others were unsettled, struggling to accept that someone they had respected could have been hiding so much. But for most, the arrest brought a sense of clarity, that justice, though slow, was still possible. Maria moved carefully through these days, still maintaining her low profile. She didn't explain her role to anyone outside the agency. She remained the quiet woman in the corner booth, the steady driver of the silver sedan. Only those directly involved knew how central she had been to the investigation. And that was how Maria preferred it. One evening, as she wrote in her journal, she paused over a simple thought: the truth always waits for its moment. She underlined the words, letting them settle on the page. For her, this was the heart of her work. She never rushed, never forced. She waited, she observed, and when the moment came, she acted. Now, as Holt sat in federal custody, Maria knew that the story was far from finished. The real work of uncovering the full network would take time. But the first, most important step had been taken. Her role in that turning point was quiet, almost invisible to the outside world. Yet it had been decisive. She had carried the warrant, she had spoken the words, and she had watched as a man who once thought himself untouchable realized he was not beyond the reach of truth. The days after Holt's arrest moved quickly, though Maria experienced them with a quiet stillness. To the outside world, everything seemed loud. Newspapers wrote about it, townspeople whispered in markets, and officers spoke in cautious tones inside the precinct. Yet Maria carried herself as she always had, calm and deliberate, her presence almost unnoticed. From her apartment window, she could see life returning to its normal rhythm: children walking to school, neighbors greeting each other, the sound of lawnmowers on weekends. But beneath that calm surface, she knew the town was forever changed. Holt's name had carried weight for years. His authority had shaped the way people lived and the way they trusted. Now that trust had been broken, and broken trust left marks that could not be easily erased. Maria reflected on this often. She thought about the people who had spoken quietly to her, sharing their unease without realizing they were contributing to something larger. She remembered the waitress at the diner, the mechanic at the garage, the cashier who noticed unusual visits. None of them had shouted or demanded attention, they had simply whispered truth in their own ways. Maria had gathered those whispers, and together, they had formed a voice strong enough to be heard at the highest levels. That was always the nature of her work: building truth from small, fragile pieces. And in Holt's case, those pieces had revealed not only his actions but also a pattern of behavior that reached further than many had suspected. As federal investigators dug deeper, they uncovered connections Holt had maintained beyond the town. Records of unexplained income, unusual property dealings, and suspicious meetings surfaced. Each new discovery confirmed what Maria had felt from the beginning: Holt had not acted alone. He had been part of something larger, a web of choices and agreements that thrived in silence. For Maria, this realization brought both relief and weight. Relief, because the truth was finally being seen. Weight, because she understood that one arrest was not the end. The legacy of corruption, once uncovered, required years of work to untangle. She often thought about her father's words: patience will protect you when courage is not enough. Those words had carried her through long days of waiting, through the quiet tests of her endurance. And now, looking back, she understood them even more deeply. It had not been courage alone that allowed her to face Holt in the hallway with the warrant. It had been patience: the patience to listen, to wait, and to move only when the time was right. In the weeks that followed, Maria continued her routines. She returned to the coffee shop, sat in her favorite booth, and wrote in her notebook. People noticed her more now. Some approached her with gentle curiosity, asking if she had known anything about what happened. Maria always answered with a polite smile, never revealing her true role. She remained the quiet observer, never the center of the story. But in private moments, she allowed herself to think about the meaning of it all. She thought about the delicate balance of trust between citizens and those who wore a badge. She thought about how easy it was for that trust to be shaken, and how difficult it was to restore. Most of all, she thought about the ordinary people who lived their lives believing that fairness and honesty were the foundation of their community. For them, the work she had done mattered most. Maria also recognized the personal legacy this case would leave with her. Every operation she had worked on before carried lessons, but this one felt different. It had tested her in a personal way. The planted bag in her car had been more than a tactic, it had been an attempt to erase her completely. Yet she had remained steady, turning that very trap into the final piece of proof needed for justice. It reminded her of something she often wrote in her journal: silence can be used to hide, but silence can also be used to watch. Holt had tried to use silence as a shield for his actions. Maria had used silence as her strength, her method of uncovering truth. In the end, it was her silence that prevailed. As months passed, the legal process continued. Holt faced hearings, questions, and the slow but steady weight of evidence. For Maria, the details no longer needed her attention. Her role was complete. She had gathered the pieces, carried the warrant, and handed the truth into the hands of justice. And yet, her work never truly ended. Soon, she would be called to another assignment, another quiet town, another story waiting to be told. That was the nature of her life, moving from one silence to another, never staying long enough for the world to know her but always long enough to uncover what needed to be seen. On her final night before leaving the town, Maria sat once more in her silver sedan. The same car that had carried the planted bag now carried only her small suitcase and notebook. She looked around the quiet streets, the familiar storefronts, and the people moving about with a new sense of awareness. She knew they would rebuild trust slowly, step by step, but she also knew they were stronger for having faced the truth. She turned the key in the ignition, listening to the steady hum of the engine. For her, the car symbolized the journey, sometimes a place of danger, sometimes a place of safety, but always a companion in her work. As she drove away, she didn't look back. She never did. Her role was never to remain, it was always to move forward. In her notebook, she left one final line before closing it for the night: truth does not shout, it waits. And when it is revealed, it changes everything. That was the legacy she carried with her. Not the arrest, not the headlines, not even the memory of Holt's face when the warrant was shown. The legacy was the reminder that patience, observation, and quiet dedication could shift the balance of power. That ordinary voices, when gathered together, could be strong enough to uncover what had been hidden. Maria's story in that town ended, but the meaning of it continued. For those who had lived under the shadow of silence, the arrest marked a turning point. For Maria, it was another chapter in a life dedicated to uncovering truth. And in the stillness of her departure, she carried with her the same steady belief she had always held, that justice, though slow, never truly disappears. It waits, like a whisper in the background, until the right moment comes to be heard.